Can you imagine being married out of obligation and rejected by your own husband? This woman lived exactly that until during their honeymoon, he discovered something that changed everything: her purity. The story of how a forced marriage transformed into true love will move you. Tell me what country you're watching from. And if you want to know all the details of this incredible transformation, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. The harsh sound of crystal shattering against cold marble echoed throughout the hall, followed by a cutting silence that froze the blood of everyone present. The champagne flute had slipped from Emily's trembling hands at the exact moment her new husband James turned to her, with eyes full of contempt, and spoke words that would shatter any heart. Don't delude yourself into thinking this marriage means anything more than a business arrangement. The ceremony had ended just minutes ago, but it already seemed an eternity since Emily had walked down the aisle of the old stone chapel in Napa Valley, wrapped in the silk dress that had belonged to her grandmother. The scent of lavender and rosemary that perfumed the air cruelly contrasted with the bitterness now filling her chest. The guests pretended not to hear, averting uncomfortable glances toward the floral arrangements decorating the courtyard of the estate where they were celebrating the union. Emily's father, Robert Parker, clenched his fists under the table until his knuckles turned white as the limestone that covered the century-old walls. Emily, a 21-year-old woman with amber-colored eyes, raised her chin with a dignity that surprised even James. She would not shed tears, not here, not in front of all those who perfectly knew that her marriage was the Parker family's desperate last card to save the land that had belonged to them for generations. "I never had any illusions, Mr. Anderson," she responded with controlled voice. "I perfectly understand the nature of our arrangement." The air between them grew dense, charged with tensions and unspoken truths. The musicians, sensing the atmosphere, began to play with renewed enthusiasm, trying to drown out the echo of that shattered crystal that seemed to symbolize what awaited them. Sometimes the heart must break completely to be rebuilt with new foundations, Emily thought, as she observed the brilliant fragments scattered across the floor, remembering the words her grandmother Sarah whispered when, as a child, she taught her how to graft new shoots onto the century-old vines. James Anderson, at 39, was the epitome of success in San Francisco's business circles. Tall, with angular features and penetrating gaze, he had built an import empire for spices that operated from San Francisco to South America. His reputation as a ruthless negotiator was only surpassed by his fame as a cold and inaccessible man. For him, this marriage represented only the acquisition of the best vineyards in Napa Valley, a strategic expansion for his commercial empire. The sun was beginning to hide behind the California hills, bathing the courtyard in golden light that transformed the moment into a scene of painful beauty. The cypress trees, marble fountains with crystal-clear water, the mosaic of tiles beneath their feet. Everything seemed to mock the farce they were performing. Emily breathed deeply, absorbing the scent of jasmine climbing up the whitewashed walls. She had promised herself to survive this day, this marriage, this life that now stretched before her like an unknown and threatening path. She didn't know then that this path, begun with broken crystal and hurtful words, would lead her to discover strengths she didn't know she possessed and, perhaps, to find a type of love she didn't even dare imagine. The first rays of dawn filtered timidly through the lace curtains when Emily opened her eyes in her new room. The opposite side of the bed remained untouched, as it had every morning for 3 weeks. James had made it clear from the beginning that they would share a roof, but not a bed, a situation which, far from offending her, provided the only comfort in that golden cage. Anderson Estate was an imposing 19th-century building, with inner courtyards where fountains murmured day and night, galleries supported by marble columns, and rooms that held the secrets of generations. Emily still got lost in that labyrinth of corridors and chambers, feeling more like an intruder than the lady of the house. She rose with determination, ready to face a new day in her strange condition as a wife without a husband. After dressing simply, rejecting the luxurious dresses James had ordered for her, she headed to the oldest part of the estate, where she had discovered, almost by accident, an abandoned library that had become her refuge. The smell of old paper and aged leather welcomed her like an embrace when she pushed open the heavy oak door. The room, circular and crowned by a small dome, housed shelves reaching to the ceiling, filled with volumes that no one had touched for decades. "Good morning, my friends," she whispered to the books as she opened the shutters to let in the morning light. She spent hours cataloguing those forgotten treasures: botany treatises, poetry collections from the Gilded Age, manuscripts about irrigation techniques that pioneers had implemented in these same lands centuries before. Among those yellowed pages, Emily found the freedom that was denied to her in the rest of the house. That morning, while reorganizing a section of old diaries, a small notebook bound in green leather slipped out from between two larger volumes. Opening it, she discovered the delicate calligraphy of a woman, Elizabeth Anderson, James's grandmother. "There is no greater prison than a loveless marriage, nor a greater act of rebellion than finding one's own voice amid walls of silence," she read on the first page, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The hours passed unnoticed as Emily immersed herself in the life of this woman who, like her, had arrived at this same estate as part of a marriage arrangement. Elizabeth described her attempts to transform her cage into a home, her struggle to maintain her essence in a world that valued only her surname, and her ability to provide heirs. "I see you've discovered my grandmother." James's deep voice startled her, making her close the diary with a snap. She hadn't heard him enter. James remained on the threshold, his figure outlined against the light from the hallway, observing her with an indecipherable expression. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry," Emily responded, standing up with the notebook still in her hands. "Don't apologize," he said, advancing toward her with measured steps. Elizabeth would have appreciated someone reading her words after so long. She was an extraordinary woman trapped in ordinary circumstances. For an instant, Emily thought she detected a glimmer of humanity in those usually cold eyes, but it disappeared so quickly that she might have imagined it. "She transformed this place," James continued, surveying the library with his gaze. "Before her arrival, this room was a storage space for tools. She convinced my grandfather to convert it into a library, arguing that a businessman needed culture to compete with European merchants." Emily observed the circular room with new perspective, imagining Elizabeth supervising the construction of the shelves, selecting each volume with purpose and passion. "Then I find myself in good company," she murmured, more to herself than to him. James looked at her intently, as if truly seeing her for the first time, before adding, "I came to inform you that I must leave for San Francisco tomorrow. There are spice shipments waiting at the port and matters that require my presence." "How long will you be away?" she asked, surprised by her own interest. 3 weeks, perhaps a month," he replied, already heading toward the door. "Tom will help you with any estate-related matters. In my absence, you're free to move about the property as you wish." Emily nodded, feeling a contradictory mixture of relief and abandonment. When James was about to exit, he added, "If you're interested in my grandmother, you should look in the trunk under the east window. That's where she kept her true treasures." And with these enigmatic words, he disappeared down the corridor, leaving behind the echo of his firm steps on the marble floor. The fine wooden trunk rested beneath the eastern window, covered by a faded tapestry that Emily had ignored during her days of refuge in the library. With trembling hands, she removed the fabric to discover a cedar chest carved with floral motifs, closed with a small bronze padlock. The key was nowhere to be found, but Emily, raised among vineyards where one had to improvise solutions with whatever was at hand, extracted a hairpin from her hair and, after several attempts, managed to open the rusted mechanism. The interior of the trunk emitted the scent of dried lavender and old paper. It contained an orderly collection of notebooks, letters tied with ribbons of different colors, and small objects that must have held special meaning for Elizabeth: a polished stone with blue veins, a silver thimble, a lock of a child's hair wrapped in silk. Emily reverently extracted a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. The first, dated 1952, was signed by William Anderson, James's father. In it, with angular and authoritarian handwriting, he detailed to Elizabeth's father the conditions of an agreement: the marriage of his son Charles, James's future father, to young Elizabeth in exchange for the economic salvation of her family's vineyards, devastated by phylloxera. Emily's heart accelerated as she recognized a pattern that extended to her own marriage. With growing unease, she continued reading the correspondence that spanned almost 2 decades. The letters revealed a family strategy: The Andersons patiently observed landowning families with potential, waited for their moment of vulnerability, and then offered advantageous marriages that were, in reality, disguised acquisitions. The last letter in the bundle, written by James's father to his son, dated just 3 years earlier, specifically mentioned the Parkers. The Parker vineyards will be ours in less than 5 years. The last harvests have been disastrous, and Robert is neck-deep in debt. When the time comes, we'll offer your hand to the daughter, Emily. She's a well-educated girl and, according to our informants, possesses valuable knowledge about traditional cultivation that could benefit us. Keep your distance, but observe them. Patience is our best ally in this hunt. Nausea invaded Emily as the pieces fit together in her mind. It hadn't been bad fortune that ruined her family. It had been a calculated weight, a cold and methodical manipulation culminating in her marriage. She felt like an animal led to slaughter, with the illusion that it was walking toward green pastures. But alongside indignation, something else began to grow within her, an iron determination that transformed her melancholy into purpose. If the Andersons had played a game of patience for generations, she would prove she could play better. With hands steadier than might be expected, Emily returned the letters to their place except for the last one, which she carefully folded and hid within the folds of her dress. Then she closed the trunk and replaced the tapestry, leaving everything exactly as she had found it. "I won't be another Elizabeth," she murmured to herself as the afternoon light tinged the library with copper hues. "I won't limit myself to creating beauty inside my cage. I'll open it from within." That evening Emily dined alone in the great dining room, as was already customary. The tinkling of her cutlery against the china reverberated in the silence of the room. Portraits of generations of Andersons seemed to observe her from the walls, silent witnesses to another woman trapped in their net. But this time, as she slowly savored each bite, Emily began to trace a plan. The letters had revealed not only the Andersons' strategy, but also their weakness, their conviction that land was merely a financial asset, not a living being that required knowledge, tradition, and respect. For the first time since her wedding, Emily slept deeply without nightmares. In her dreams, the century-old vines of her childhood whispered secrets that only she could understand, secrets she would transform into her salvation. At dawn, when the first light of day caressed her face, Emily already knew exactly what she had to do. The library had shown her the past, but it had also given her the tools to rewrite her future. During the 3 weeks of James's absence, Emily transformed her pain into action. Each morning, after a frugal breakfast in the kitchen to the dismay of the cook, who insisted that the lady should eat in the dining room, she headed to the vineyards that extended like an undulating sea to the horizon. Dressed in simple clothes and a straw hat to protect herself from the relentless California sun, she walked among the rows of vines, many of them centuries old, caressing their twisted trunks as if greeting old friends. The workers initially observed her with suspicion, then with curiosity, and finally with respect, seeing that this young lady knew the secrets of the land better than many of them. "The problem isn't the vines," Emily explained to Tom, the estate manager, as they examined a particularly affected section. "It's how we've treated them in recent years." Tom, a man tempered by decades under the Napa Valley sun, looked at her skeptically. "With all due respect, Mum, we've been cultivating these lands since before you were born." "And before you," Emily replied without acrimony. "My grandfather taught me that vines are like people. They need respect, not just efficiency. The Andersons have applied intensive methods that exhaust the soil. They've forgotten that the vine is a plant of eternity, not of quarterly results." The manager remained silent, surprised not so much by her words as by the passion with which she pronounced them. "What do you propose, then?" he finally asked. Emily spread out on an improvised table the ancient treatises she had found in the library, along with the notebooks where her grandfather had meticulously recorded his traditional cultivation methods. "Going back to the roots," she said, pointing to detailed illustrations of irrigation systems used by early California settlers, using traditional pruning techniques, recovering soil biodiversity, reintroducing companion plants that naturally strengthen the vines. "Mr. James will never approve it," Tom objected, although his gaze revealed a growing interest. "He seeks immediate results, not experiments." "They won't be experiments," Emily replied with serenity. There'll be solutions proven for centuries that we've forgotten in our modern haste, and we don't need his approval to start with a small plot. By the time he returns, we'll have data to show him. Thus began Emily's silent revolution. With a small group of volunteer workers, they restored an abandoned section of the vineyard, applying methods that combined ancestral wisdom with modern knowledge of sustainable agriculture. The days were exhausting but rewarding. Emily worked side by side with the laborers, earning their respect not with orders but with example. Her hands, once soft, began to harden. Her skin acquired the golden tone of those who live in the open air. At night, while physical exhaustion dulled the emotional pain, she meticulously recorded every observation, every small progress. She knew she would need concrete data to confront James, to prove to him that her vision wasn't a romantic whim, but a viable strategy. At the end of the third week, when the first results began to appear in the form of new shoots on plants that had seemed moribund, a telegram arrived announcing James's early return. Emily felt an unsettling mixture of nervousness and determination. She was no longer the same woman he had left behind, immersed in the melancholy of her forced marriage. The afternoon before his arrival, while supervising the installation of a drip irrigation system adapted from early California designs, she heard the unmistakable sound of a car approaching along the dirt road. She looked up to see a black Jaguar raising dust among the vines, stopping a few meters from where she stood. James descended from the vehicle with a severe expression, his impeccable suit in dramatic contrast to Emily's dirt-stained work clothes. For an instant neither spoke, measuring each other like two fencers before combat. "I see you've been busy in my absence," he finally said, his tone indecipherable as he observed the transformations in the vineyard. Emily straightened up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Everyone uses their time as they see fit," she responded. "I decided to invest mine in saving what remains of these lands." What Emily couldn't know was that, while traveling the ports of San Francisco, James had reflected on the woman he had left behind, intrigued by her silent dignity, by her interest in Elizabeth's library. For the first time in his life of cold calculations, an unforeseen variable had entered his equation. The first true challenge of their marriage was about to begin, and neither was prepared for the consequences. James's office, an austere room dominated by a mahogany desk and shelves full of accounting books, became the scene of their first real confrontation. Emily had formally requested a meeting, as if she were a business partner and not his wife, a gesture that disconcerted James as much as it aroused his curiosity. "I've reviewed the accounts for the last 5 years," Emily began without preamble, spreading graphs and tables she had meticulously prepared across the desk. "The yield of the vineyards has decreased by 30%, while production costs have increased by almost the same proportion." James studied the documents with an impenetrable expression, but a muscle tensing in his jaw betrayed his surprise. "I didn't know you had knowledge of accounting," he commented, raising his gaze to her. "There are many things you don't know about me," Emily replied calmly. "My father insisted I learn all aspects of the family business, even when it was evident that my brother would inherit the lands." A dense silence followed, as James continued examining the numbers. Emily remained standing, aware that sitting would be perceived as a sign of submission. "These data are correct," James finally admitted, "but I don't see what you propose to do about it, beyond your experiments in the East Sector." "They're not experiments," Emily unfolded a new set of documents. "They're traditional methods supported by centuries of evidence. I've prepared a plan to gradually implement them throughout the estate, starting with the most affected areas. It includes a cost analysis and yield projections for the next 3 years. James's expression darkened. "And have you considered that perhaps I have my own plans for those lands?" His voice acquired a dangerous edge. "Plans that might not include vines at all." Emily felt the blood freeze in her veins, but she maintained her composure. "What do you mean?" "I have investors interested in converting part of the property into a tourist complex," James revealed, studying her reaction. "Rural tourism is on the rise, and this area has potential to attract visitors from all over the country. You would uproot century-old vines to build rooms with air conditioning?" Indignation made her voice tremble slightly. "I would uproot whatever necessary to ensure profitability," he responded coldly. "Sentimentality has no place in business." Emily breathed deeply, controlling the fury that threatened to overwhelm her. "I propose a deal," she finally said. "Give me a year with my project. If in that time I can't increase production and wine quality, I won't oppose your tourism plans." James observed her with renewed interest, as if suddenly discovering a valuable piece on a chessboard he thought he completely dominated. "And what do I gain by accepting this challenge? Besides a wine that could be sold at a premium price in your international markets," Emily made a strategic pause, "I offer you my knowledge of aromatic and medicinal herbs. You could expand your spice trade with exclusive products grown right here, without intermediaries cutting into your margins." James's eyes momentarily gleamed with genuine interest. If there was something he respected, it was a well-founded business proposal. 6 months, he countered. "And I want detailed weekly reports." 9 months, Emily replied without hesitation. "The vine has its own timeline, which neither you nor I can accelerate, and I agree to provide the reports." James rose and walked to the window, from where he could see the undulating sea of vines extending to the horizon. He remained silent for so long that Emily began to fear he would reject her proposal. 9 months, he finally consented, turning to look at her. "But I'll personally supervise the project. I don't trust leaving something so important solely in your hands, however capable they may seem." Emily nodded, hiding the satisfaction it gave her to have obtained exactly what she wanted. An opportunity to prove her worth and, more importantly, time to execute the second phase of her plan. "Tomorrow at dawn in the vineyards," she said, gathering her documents. "I'll show you what we've accomplished so far." When Emily left the office, James remained by the window, contemplating the slender figure of his wife as she crossed the courtyard toward the library. For the first time since he had met her, he felt a pang of doubt. Was it possible he had underestimated the young woman he had chosen solely for the lands she brought to the marriage? "Don't confuse business acumen with something deeper," he warned himself. But an inner voice, which sounded suspiciously like that of his grandmother Elizabeth, whispered to him that it was already too late for that warning. Autumn arrived in the vineyards with a deceptive gentleness, bringing rains that transformed the arid land into a canvas of timid green. Emily and James established a work routine that, to their surprise, functioned with increasing fluidity. Each morning, they toured the different sections of the estate together, discussing progress, challenges, and necessary adjustments to the original plan. What began as suspicious supervision on James's part gradually evolved toward genuine interest. Emily's passion for the vines proved contagious, and he himself was surprised to ask questions that went beyond simple financial control. "My grandfather used to say that each vine has its own personality," Emily explained one afternoon, as they examined a particularly ancient plant. "This old grumbler, for example, has always been reluctant to give its grapes easily. It must be treated with special care during pruning." James observed her with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. "You talk about them as if they were people." "They're living beings that have witnessed more history than any of us," she replied, caressing the rough bark. "Some of these vines were already here when the gold rush began. They've survived droughts, wars, changes of owners. They deserve respect, not just yield calculations." James fell silent, contemplating the landscape with new eyes. He had grown up seeing the land as just another asset in his investment portfolio, never as something alive that required understanding and care. The project advanced with promising results. The vines treated with traditional methods showed signs of recovery, and preliminary analyses of the wine indicated superior quality. Emily had also begun to cultivate a garden of aromatic herbs in a plot near the estate, implementing permaculture techniques that maximized production with minimal intervention. It was in that garden that the first moment of genuine connection between them occurred. Emily was teaching a group of women from the nearby town how to distill essences of lavender and rosemary when James approached, attracted by the aromas that permeated the air. "My mother used to do this," he commented with an unusually soft voice, observing the copper still from which essential oil slowly dripped. "When I was a child, she allowed me to help her collect the plants. It's one of the few happy memories I retain from my childhood." Emily looked at him in surprise. It was the first time James had shared something personal, a flash of vulnerability in a man who seemed built entirely of ambition and calculation. "What happened to your mother?" she asked delicately. "She died when I was 12, he replied, his gaze lost on the horizon. "Tuberculosis. My father never spoke of her again. He ordered all her portraits and belongings removed, as if he wanted to erase any evidence that she had ever existed." "That's terrible," Emily murmured, feeling an unexpected compassion toward the man she had until then seen only as her captor. "It was my father's way of dealing with pain," James shrugged, as if minimizing the matter. "He taught me that feelings are a weakness in the business world, a lesson I learned well." The silence that followed was laden with unexpressed meanings. Emily continued working with the still, aware of James's gaze upon her. "Perhaps you'd like to learn the process," she finally suggested. "It's not very different from what your mother did, I imagine." To her surprise, James nodded and approached, allowing Emily to guide his hands in the delicate process of separating the essences. For a brief moment, their fingers touched, and both felt an unexpected current, a connection that went beyond simple physical contact. That afternoon marked a turning point. Something had changed between them, subtle but undeniably. Dinners, previously characterized by uncomfortable silences or strictly professional conversations, began to lengthen with discussions about books they had both read, childhood memories shared with growing trust, even occasional laughter at anecdotes from the workers, or absurd situations of daily life. The outside world seemed to move further and further away. James's business visits to San Francisco became more spaced out, and when he had to be absent, nightly phone calls became habitual, presumably to discuss the project's progress, although both knew there was something more to those conversations. Emily found herself waiting for those calls, longing to hear James's deep voice on the other end of the line. She reproached herself for these feelings, reminding herself of the letters she had discovered, the manipulation to which her family had been subjected. But each day it became more difficult to maintain defenses raised against a man who, slowly, began to reveal layers of humanity beneath his facade of ruthless businessman. The transformation wasn't unilateral. James observed with amazement how Emily blossomed in that environment, how her natural beauty intensified with the passion she put into every aspect of the project. He no longer saw her as a means to obtain valuable lands, but as an extraordinary woman whose strength and determination challenged everything he thought he knew about human relationships. Autumn advanced, and with it a seed of something unexpected began to germinate between them, as imperceptible at first as the new shoots that emerged on the restored vines. Winter arrived with unusual ferocity in the Napa Valley. Leaden clouds accumulated for days over the vineyards, presaging the storm that all the workers commented on with growing concern. Emily had been anxiously reviewing the weather forecasts, aware that a severe frost could compromise months of work. The afternoon when the storm finally broke, Emily was in the greenhouse she had built next to the herb garden. It was a modest but functional space where she cultivated medicinal plants that she then distributed free of charge among the inhabitants of the nearby town, earning herself a respect and affection that contrasted with the intimidating reputation of the Andersons. The wind began to howl with increasing force, shaking the greenhouse structure. Through the glass panels misted with condensation, Emily observed with alarm how the sky darkened prematurely, while the first drops of rain rapidly transformed into a violent downpour. She was securing the seedling trays when she heard a harrowing crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. An elm branch torn by the wind had pierced the greenhouse roof. In seconds, the icy rain began to flood the interior, threatening months of patient work. Emily acted on instinct, trying to save what she could. With frantic movements, she transferred the most delicate plants to a corner that remained dry, improvising protection with tarps and materials she had at hand. Her fingers, numbed by cold, moved with desperate determination while water already swirled around her ankles. It was at that moment that the greenhouse door opened violently. James appeared on the threshold, drenched and with his face contorted by concern. "Emily, we need to get out of here now," he shouted to be heard above the roar of the storm. "The structure is giving way." She shook her head without ceasing to work. "I can't abandon them. It's months of work. The chamomile for children's fever, the thyme for the elders' cough." James approached, avoiding broken glass and ever-deepening puddles. "It's too dangerous," he insisted, taking her by the arm. "We can rebuild all this after." At that precise instant, a new creak, more threatening than the previous one, shook the entire structure. Without time for discussion, James took Emily in his arms and ran toward the exit, just as a complete section of the roof collapsed behind them. They managed to reach the shelter of the nearest tool shed, where James carefully set Emily down. Both gasped, drenched and trembling, as they listened to the crash of the greenhouse completely collapsing. Emily felt something breaking inside her. It wasn't just plants she had lost. It was the tangible symbol of her purpose, of her identity beyond the forced marriage. Unable to contain herself, tears began to mix with the raindrops that still slid down her face. James watched her in silence, disconcerted by this display of emotion in someone who had always maintained an unshakable dignity. "They're just plants, Emily," he finally said, in a clumsy attempt to console her. "We can build a better, bigger greenhouse." She shook her head, unable to explain that her pain went well beyond the lost plants. "You don't understand," she murmured. "That greenhouse was the only thing that was truly mine, the only thing I did because I wanted to, not because it was part of our arrangement." James remained motionless, understanding for the first time the depth of Emily's loneliness, a loneliness that he himself had imposed with his conditions and his coldness. "I'm sorry," he said in a low voice, words that had never before left his lips with sincerity. Emily raised her eyes, surprised as much by the words as by the genuinely repentant tone. "Why did you come looking for me?" she asked. "You could have waited for the storm to subside." James looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. "When I saw the direction of the storm, I realized the greenhouse was in danger. And I knew you would be there, trying to save your plants regardless of the risk." "How could you be so sure?" "Because I know you better than you think," he replied, with an honesty that surprised them both. "Because I've been watching you these months, not just supervising a project, but discovering you." The silence that followed was charged with tension, but not the usual antagonistic tension that had characterized their relationship, but something new, vibrant, and disconcerting. Emily shivered, as much from the cold as from the intensity of the moment. James, noticing her trembling, removed his wet jacket and sought a rough blanket on a shelf in the shed, awkwardly wrapping it around Emily's shoulders. His hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, and when their gazes met, something definitively changed between them. There were no words or romantic gestures, just a silent recognition that the carefully constructed barriers were beginning to crumble, like the greenhouse under the fury of the storm. They remained in the shed until the tempest subsided, speaking little but communicating much in those silences that no longer felt uncomfortable. When they finally returned to the estate, walking side by side under a sky that was beginning to clear, both knew they had survived something more than a natural storm. The real storm, the one that would irrevocably transform their lives, was just beginning to form in their hearts. The travel proposal arose unexpectedly during breakfast, 3 weeks after the storm that had destroyed the greenhouse. Emily had been immersed in reconstruction, this time with more resistant materials and an improved design financed by James, without objections or profitability calculations. "I need to travel to Sonoma next week," he commented, studying some documents while savoring his coffee. "There are some lands near Healdsburg that could be interesting to expand our aromatic herb project." Emily raised her eyes from her cup, surprised as much by the "our" as by the mention of an expansion she hadn't proposed. "Healdsburg? I've read they have unique herb cultivation traditions, especially for the preparation of local liqueurs." "Precisely," James nodded. "I thought you might be interested in accompanying me. It would be educational for the project." There was a revealing hesitation in his voice, an insecurity improper for the ruthless businessman Emily had met months before. "It would be very useful, yes," she replied, hiding the unexpected flutter in her chest. "I could study their cultivation methods and adapt them to our climate." Both pretended it was merely a practical decision, deliberately ignoring that it would be the first time they traveled together, that they would share spaces more intimate than the vineyards and work meetings. The morning of departure, Emily waited in the courtyard with a small suitcase. She had carefully chosen her clothes, more elegant than her usual work attire, but preserving the simplicity that characterized her. A cream-colored linen dress, a silk shawl for evenings by the sea, a wide-brimmed hat to protect herself from the Californian sun. When James appeared, Emily noticed that he too had taken special care with his appearance. Instead of his usual dark business suits, He wore light pants and a blue linen shirt that softened his angular features. For an instant, they looked at each other as if seeing each other for the first time, recognizing in the other a beauty they had decided to ignore until then. The drive to Sonoma unfolded in an atmosphere of contained expectation. They conversed about safe topics, the advances in the vineyards, projections for the next harvest, the business contacts James hoped to establish in the region, but beneath the surface of those pragmatic words flowed a current of unresolved tension. The inn they had reserved exceeded Emily's expectations. It was an old Victorian house with golden wooden walls, a wraparound porch, and bougainvillea climbing its walls. From the terrace, one could see the Pacific Ocean, an infinite canvas of turquoise blue that seemed to merge with the sky at the horizon. "It's perfect," Emily murmured, absorbed in the beauty of the landscape. "I thought you would like it," James replied, pleased with her reaction. "The owners are old acquaintances. They cultivate Pinot Noir grapes on terraces with methods that date back to the early settlers." The first night they dined on the terrace, under a sky studded with stars brighter than any Emily had ever seen before. The local wine, the aroma of herbs growing in pots around the table, the warm breeze that brought the distant rumor of waves, everything contributed to creating an atmosphere that gradually dissolved the barriers between them. "You never told me why you accepted this marriage," James suddenly said, breaking a comfortable silence. "You knew it was a business arrangement, that there were no feelings involved. Why did you agree?" Emily contemplated her glass before responding, organizing thoughts she had never shared with anyone. "For my family, mainly," she admitted. "My father was desperate. The debts, the bad harvests. I saw how he aged prematurely with each new letter from the bank." She paused, remembering those dark days. "But I also did it for the vines," she continued. "It will sound strange, but I couldn't bear the idea that they would end up in the hands of speculators who would uproot them to build tourist apartments. They are part of my history, of my identity. At least with you." She stopped, fearing she had said too much. "With me what?" James gently pressed. "At least with you, there existed the possibility that you would keep them, even if only for their commercial value," she concluded, "and that gave me time to try to safeguard them somehow." James observed her with new perspective, as if finally understanding the depth of her connection with that land he had seen only as an asset in his portfolio. "I accepted this marriage because it was what was expected of me," he confessed after a long silence. Another strategic acquisition, another step in the expansion of the Anderson empire. I never questioned my father's plan, the family tradition. He took a sip of wine, his eyes lost on the marine horizon. "Until I began to see you work in the vineyards, to understand your vision, to realize that perhaps there were other ways to measure success, beyond quarterly balances and profit projections." The honesty of that confession created an invisible bridge between them, a space of shared vulnerability that neither had anticipated. The following days passed in a bubble of mutual discovery. Together they visited wineries where pioneering methods had been perfected, toured cultivation terraces carved into the hillside centuries ago, got lost in narrow streets where time seemed to have stopped. It was during one of these explorations that the incident occurred that would definitively change the course of their relationship. While Emily was helping a local elderly woman collect wild rosemary on a steep slope, she slipped on the unstable terrain. The fall wasn't serious, but in trying to stop it, Emily suffered a deep cut in the palm of her hand from a sharp rock. James, who was observing the scene from a few meters away, ran toward her with an expression of anguish that revealed feelings much deeper than simple concern for a business partner. That night, as Emily lay feverish due to a minor infection in the wound, James watched over her sleep with a dedication that would surprise anyone who knew him in San Francisco's business circles. Between fever deliriums, Emily murmured fragments of her childhood, revelations about sacrifices she had made for her family, abandoned dreams of studying botany at UC Davis. When she awoke at dawn, she found James asleep in a chair next to her bed, his hand still gently holding hers to avoid pressing on the bandaged wound. In that moment of shared vulnerability, observing the sleeping face of the man who had entered her life as an adversary and who now watched over her sleep with unexpected devotion, Emily recognized a truth she had been trying to deny. She was falling in love with James Anderson. What she couldn't know was that James, contemplating the sunrise from the terrace after ensuring her fever had subsided, was reaching exactly the same disconcerting conclusion about his feelings toward her. The car descended the Pacific Coast Highway under a sky veiled with low clouds that promised rain. Emily observed through the window how the California landscape gradually replaced the blue intensity of the Pacific they had left behind in Sonoma. Beside her, James drove with apparent concentration, though his gaze occasionally shifted toward her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but it was charged with unresolved tension. The 5 days in Sonoma had transformed something fundamental in their relationship, creating an intimate space that neither knew exactly how to navigate now that they were returning to the reality of the estate, the vineyards, and the expectations of the outside world. During the drive back, the rain began to fall, first as a light drizzle, then with increasing intensity until it transformed into a downpour that blurred the landscape beyond the windows. "It will be good for the vines," Emily commented, breaking a silence that had extended too long. "You always think of them first, don't you?" James replied, with a smile that softened the question. "They're easier to understand than people," she admitted. "More predictable, more honest in a way." James nodded, understanding the subtext of her words. "What happened in Sonoma?" he began, but stopped, unsure how to continue. Emily felt her heart accelerate. "What exactly happened in Sonoma, James?" He kept his gaze fixed on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with more force than necessary. "I think we both know," he finally replied. "Something changed. Something that wasn't in the marriage contract, nor in the business plans, nor in anything we had foreseen." Emily observed his profile outlined against the rainy landscape, recognizing the internal struggle reflected in his expression. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a whisper barely audible above the pattering of the rain. "Of what?" he asked, briefly shifting his gaze toward her. "Of trusting, of believing that this is real and not another business strategy, of discovering tomorrow or in a month or in a year that it was all an elaborate maneuver to ensure my cooperation in your projects." The rawness of her honesty hit James like a slap. He reduced speed and stopped the car on the shoulder, turning off the engine. The rain redoubled in intensity, creating a curtain of water that isolated them from the outside world. "Emily, he began, but she interrupted him. "I found the letters," she revealed, meeting his gaze with determination. "In Elizabeth's trunk, the correspondence between your father and mine. I know our ruin wasn't accidental, that the Andersons patiently observed while my family sank, waiting for the perfect moment to offer us salvation in exchange for the lands." James's face visibly paled. "When did you find them?" "Months ago, before we started the vineyard project. And yet you continued. You worked with me knowing all that." Emily nodded slowly. "At first I did it for revenge, to prove I wasn't the docile piece in your chess game. After," her voice cracked slightly, "after I began to see the man behind the Anderson name, and that complicated everything." James remained silent, processing the revelation. Finally, with an unexpected gesture, he took Emily's hands in his. "I can't change the past," he said gravely. "I can't deny that our marriage began as a calculated transaction. But I can promise you here and now that what I feel for you is the only honest thing I've experienced in my entire life." Emily's eyes filled with unshed tears. "How can I believe you?" "You can't," he replied with painful sincerity. "Not with words. Only with time, with actions, with daily proof that the man I am now is not the same one who signed that marriage contract." The rain continued to beat on the car roof, creating an irregular melody that accompanied the most sincere moment they had shared until then. "I don't know if I can risk trusting again," Emily murmured. "I've built defenses for so long." "I know," James gently squeezed her hands, "and I'll respect the time you need. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." With that tacit promise floating between them, they resumed their journey to the estate. When they finally arrived, it was already dark. The rain had subsided, leaving behind a fresh aroma of wet earth and wild herbs. Tom welcomed them with urgent news. During their absence, a group of investors had visited the lands bordering the vineyards, apparently planning a tourism development that would threaten the local ecosystem and, potentially, the water supply for the crops. "They say they have connections in Sacramento," the manager explained with concern, that no farmer can stop progress. James and Emily exchanged a significant look. The intimate bubble of Sonoma had definitely burst, throwing them back to a reality where their decisions affected not just their personal lives, but the future of the entire community that depended on those lands. "We'll deal with this at dawn tomorrow," James declared, with a determination Emily had never seen in him. "No one will threaten our work or the livelihood of our people." The hour resonated in the night air like a declaration of intent that went well beyond a simple possessive pronoun. It was a commitment, a promise, perhaps even a declaration. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Emily and James dined alone in the main dining room. Not as business partners discussing projections and strategies, but as two people rediscovering each other under a new light. The conversation flowed naturally, jumping from practical topics to childhood memories, from future plans to philosophical reflections. When they finally retired to their separate rooms, they paused a moment in the hallway, trapped in the mutual gravitation that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the distance both had established as necessary. "Good night, Emily," James said, his voice softer than usual. "Good night, James," she replied, allowing herself a vulnerable smile. "And thank you for Sonoma, for everything." He nodded, understanding all that those simple words contained. When each closed their door, they knew something fundamental had irrevocably changed. The path to trust would be long, and not without obstacles, but for the first time since their lives had intertwined, both felt it was worth traveling together. The oblique rays of the autumn sun filtered between the vine branches, creating golden patterns on the damp earth. Emily walked beside James along the northern boundary of the estate, where the Anderson lands bordered the Mayacamas Mountains Nature Reserve. In recent days, they had dedicated every hour of daylight to personally inspecting the property's boundaries, seeking to understand the magnitude of the threat posed by the tourism project. According to these plans, James explained, unfolding a map on a flat rock, the hotel complex would occupy this entire sector, including the slope that feeds the underground aquifer. Emily studied the document with a furrowed brow. "If they build here, they'll divert the natural course of the water. Our vineyards, especially the oldest sections, depend on that source. Without it—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Both understood that the consequences would be devastating, not only for their recovery project, but for the entire local ecosystem that had evolved for centuries around that delicate water balance. "Something doesn't add up," James murmured, reviewing the documents with growing unease. "This project requires permits that normally take years to be granted, especially in protected areas. However, it seems everything is advancing with unusual speed." Emily felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. "Do you think corruption is involved?" James remained silent a moment, his face darkening. "I know these investors, Emily. They're the type of people who consider laws as mere suggestions, obstacles that can be circumvented with the right amount of money in the right pockets." "And what can we do?" she asked, feeling a tightness in her chest. "We don't have that kind of influence." To her surprise, James smiled, a smile that had nothing warm and everything of iron determination. "We have something better," he said, pointing to a specific spot on the map. "We have the truth, and I believe I know where to find the evidence we need." That very afternoon, James made several calls from his office, speaking in a low voice with contacts in Sacramento and San Francisco. Emily observed him from the threshold, struck by this new aspect of her husband. No longer the cold businessman who sought to expand his empire at any cost, but a man willing to use his connections to protect something more valuable than economic gain. When he finally hung up the phone after the last call, James seemed exhausted but strangely satisfied. "I've managed to obtain copies of the original environmental studies," he announced. "The ones initially presented before they were modified to facilitate the project's approval." Emily approached, sitting across from him. "How did you get them?" "Let's say not all officials have a price," he responded with a tired smile. "There are still people with principles, even in government departments." "And what do these studies reveal?" "I don't know yet. They'll arrive tomorrow by special courier." James rubbed his eyes. "But my contact mentioned they contain information about protected species and underground aquifers that don't appear in the official version." That night, tension was palpable in the estate. Emily couldn't fall asleep, tossing and turning in her bed while imagining increasingly catastrophic scenarios. What if they couldn't stop the project? What if all her work, all her love for that land, proved insufficient against the power of money and political influence? Near midnight, unable to bear the solitude of her thoughts, she rose and wrapped herself in a wool shawl. Her steps unconsciously led her toward the library, where the light filtering under the door indicated she wasn't the only one sleepless that night. She found James seated by the window, contemplating the darkness of the vineyard under the silvery light of the moon. He didn't seem surprised when she entered, as if somehow he had been expecting her. "I couldn't sleep," Emily unnecessarily explained. "Neither could I," he replied, gesturing to the seat opposite his, too many thoughts competing for attention. They sat in silence for a while, finding comfort in the simple presence of the other. "What will we do if we can't stop them?" Emily finally asked, voicing her greatest fear. James looked at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "I don't contemplate that possibility," he said firmly. "We'll defend what's ours with all the tools at our disposal. And if that's not enough," he paused as if making a transcendental decision, "if that's not enough, I'm willing to sacrifice other investments to buy the disputed lands." Emily looked at him in astonishment. "That could cost millions. It would affect your entire business empire." "Our empire," he gently corrected. "And yes, it would be a considerable financial risk. But in these months I've learned something my father never understood. There are values that can't be measured in accounting balances." The vulnerability in his voice, the absolute honesty of that declaration, melted the last reservations in Emily's heart. Without thinking, she extended her hand to take his, a simple gesture but laden with meaning. "You've changed," she murmured. "You've changed me," he replied, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You've taught me to see beyond the numbers, to value what truly matters." The silence that followed was full of possibilities, of promises not spoken, but felt with every heartbeat. Emily was painfully aware of the warmth of his hand in hers, of the proximity of their bodies, of the intimacy of the moment they shared under the dim light of the lamp. When James finally leaned toward her, his kiss was as soft as it was inevitable, as natural as the dawn after the darkest night. Emily responded with a surrender that surprised herself, letting years of solitude and distrust dissolve in that contact that sealed a mutual transformation. The courier arrived at dawn, bringing with him a thick envelope with the promised documents. James and Emily, who had spent the rest of the night conversing in the library, sharing confidences and building bridges over abysses of silence, received the papers with renewed determination. What they found exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The original studies not only confirmed the critical importance of the aquifer for the entire region, but also documented the presence of several endangered species whose last refuge was precisely the area destined for the tourism complex. "This is all we needed," James declared, a new energy illuminating his tired face. "With these data, we can file a formal complaint and alert environmental organizations. Media pressure will do the rest." Emily nodded, but a shadow of doubt crossed her face. "These investors are powerful, James. They won't give up easily." "Neither will we," he replied with a confident smile, taking her hand. "And we have something they'll never have. We're fighting for our home, not for a line on a spreadsheet." The word home, pronounced with such conviction, resonated in Emily's heart like a fulfilled promise. For the first time since she had arrived at Anderson Estate, she didn't feel like an intruder, a piece in a commercial strategy game. She felt at home, beside the man who, against all odds, had gone from being her captor to becoming her most valuable companion. What they couldn't imagine was that this battle against the tourism project would be only the first of many challenges they would face together, tests that would strengthen the bond born among the ancient vines of Napa Valley. The news spread like wildfire through the vineyards. Water, they found water. Workers abandoned their tasks to rush to the western edge of the estate, where a team of geologists hired by James had been conducting surveys over the past few weeks. Emily arrived breathless, her hair hastily tied back and dirt stains on her dress. James was already there, animatedly conversing with the team leader, a professor from UC Davis specializing in karst hydrogeology. "Emily, come see this," James called her, with a childlike excitement she had never seen in him. "Professor Miller was right." She approached the group, making her way through the workers who were watching in amazement the spectacle, a crystalline jet of water surging from the ground, where before there had been only rocky terrain that no one had considered useful. "It's an artesian spring," explained the professor, a small man with lively eyes behind antiquated glasses, "part of an underground system that probably extends beneath this entire section of the property. Pure water, naturally filtered through limestone layers for centuries." Emily knelt beside the spring, immersing her fingers in the cold and crystalline water that gushed with surprising force. "It's miraculous," she murmured, feeling an emotion that tightened her throat. "It's science, Mrs. Anderson," the professor corrected with a kind smile. "Although I must admit that these caste systems always have something magical about them. This spring has been here all along, hidden beneath our feet, waiting to be discovered." "Like so many valuable things," James commented, exchanging a significant look with Emily that made her cheeks blush. The discovery of the spring changed everything. It not only provided an inexhaustible source of pure water for the vineyards, but opened possibilities neither had imagined. After extensive analyses, they confirmed the water had exceptional mineral properties, ideal both for organic cultivation and potentially for bottling as premium water. In the following weeks, Emily and James worked tirelessly on a new project that integrated the recovered vineyards, the herb garden, and now the spring into a sustainable agricultural system that would soon become a reference for the entire region. "I was thinking," James commented one afternoon, as they reviewed plans in the library now converted into their joint operations center, "that we could create an educational foundation, use part of the lands as a training center for traditional agricultural techniques and sustainability." Emily looked at him with surprise and delight. "A school, here?" "Why not?" he replied, becoming enthusiastic with the idea as he developed it. "You could direct it. Transmit all that knowledge you carry inside, that you inherited from your grandfather, and have expanded with your own research. We would invite agronomy students, small farmers who want to reconvert their operations." "It's a wonderful idea." Emily impulsively rose and circled the table to embrace him, a spontaneous gesture that still felt novel in their evolving relationship. "I've always dreamed of teaching, of sharing what I know." James held her close, marveling once more at how this woman had transformed his vision of the world, his priorities, his very conception of success. "We'll make it happen," he promised, kissing her forehead. "Like everything we've dreamed together these months." The legal battle against the tourism project continued, but the discovery of the spring had significantly strengthened their position. Environmental organizations had joined their cause, and several national media had published reports on the environmental and cultural value of the threatened lands. One afternoon, while Emily was supervising the installation of a drip irrigation system in the new greenhouse, considerably larger and more sophisticated than the one destroyed by the storm, she received an unexpected visit. An elderly woman from the nearby town, Mrs. Wilson, known for being the repository of local traditions and the unwritten history of the county, approached with slow but determined steps. "The water has returned," she declared without preamble, her voice cracked by age but firm in its conviction. "Just as my grandmother predicted." Emily invited her to sit in the shade of a century-old vine, intrigued by her words. "What do you mean, Mrs. Wilson?" The elderly woman gratefully accepted the glass of fresh water offered to her, taking a reverent sip before responding. "There's a legend in these lands," she began, with the ceremonious tone of one transmitting sacred knowledge. "Here it speaks of a magical spring that the native people called the life source. It says it reveals itself only to those who love the land for what it is, not for what they can extract from it." Emily listened, fascinated, while James, who had silently joined the conversation, took a seat beside them. "For generations," the elderly woman continued, "many sought the spring driven by greed, thinking of the wealth it would bring them. All failed. My grandmother, who knew the ancient stories, said the water waited for someone who would see the soul of this land, who would care for it with true love. It seems that someone was you, child." Emily felt a lump in her throat, moved by the solemnity with which the elderly woman pronounced those words which, superstition or not, resonated with a profound truth. "I haven't done anything extraordinary," she murmured. "I've only tried to honor what I learned from my elders." "And that precisely is what's extraordinary in these times," Mrs. Wilson stated, rising with effort. You've returned dignity to these lands that for too long have been treated as merchandise. The water is just the beginning of your reward." After the elderly woman's departure, Emily and James remained seated under the vine, processing in silence the strange encounter. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the landscape with copper hues that transformed the vineyards into an undulating sea of gold and silver. "Do you believe in these things?" James finally asked. "In magical springs that choose their guardians?" Emily rested her head on his shoulder, contemplating the landscape she now truly considered her own, not as possession, but as responsibility. "I believe there are ancient truths that survive in the form of legends," she replied. "And I believe that sometimes we find exactly what we need when we're ready to receive it." James intertwined his fingers with hers, reflecting on how much his perspective had changed in just a year. Where before he saw acres calculated in terms of yield per square foot, now he perceived a living ecosystem, an interdependent community of which he and Emily were part. "Like us," he murmured, gently kissing her hand. "We found each other when we were both ready for this transformation, even if neither of us knew it then." The sun finally set behind the hills, but they remained there, wrapped in a tranquil intimacy that no longer needed constant words to sustain itself. The spring had been only the physical manifestation of something that had been growing between them for months, an inexhaustible source of possibilities, of shared dreams, of a future built on foundations much more solid than a marriage contract signed out of interest. Spring arrived in the vineyards with an explosion of life that transformed the landscape. Where months before the green tones of vine leaves and the ochres of dry earth had predominated, now wild poppies, daisies, and flowering rosemary bloomed, creating a multicolored tapestry that extended as far as the eye could see. Emily contemplated the spectacle from the estate's terrace, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hands. The transformation of the landscape reflected that of her own life. What had begun as an emotional wasteland, a loveless marriage based on cold calculations, had blossomed into something she would never have believed possible. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" James's voice surprised her, though she was now accustomed to his silent way of moving. "As if the earth were celebrating our triumph." Emily smiled, leaning against him when he encircled her waist with an arm. "It's celebrating its own victory," she gently corrected. "We only gave it the opportunity." The battle against the tourism project had finally concluded in their favor. The combination of media pressure, support from environmental organizations, and crucially the revelation of irregularities in the approval process had caused the authorities to revoke the permits. The threatened lands had been declared a protected area, guaranteeing their preservation for future generations. But victory had a price. Some of the investors, resentful of the failure of their plans, had begun to exert pressure on James's import businesses in San Francisco. Contracts suddenly cancelled, unexpected bureaucratic obstacles, damaging rumors in business circles. "Any news from Michael?" Emily asked, referring to James's manager in San Francisco, who was trying to contain the damage. "He called this morning," he replied. His nonchalant tone contradicted the gravity of the situation. "We've lost the contract with the Millers in Chicago. Apparently someone suggested to them that our company was on the verge of bankruptcy." Emily tensed. "That's a hard blow. The Millers have been your clients since your father ran the business." "Our business," James corrected with a tired but genuine smile. "And yes, it's a setback, but it changes nothing." "You're losing millions to defend these vineyards," she murmured, guilt showing in her voice. "For my ideas, for my dreams." James gently turned her to face him, his hands framing Emily's face with tenderness. "For our dreams," he insisted, "and I'm not losing anything that truly matters. On the contrary, I'm gaining what I never knew I needed until you came into my life." The sincerity in his eyes dispelled Emily's doubts. She had become accustomed to this new version of James, the man who had gradually emerged from behind the facade of the ruthless businessman, but the depth of his transformation still surprised her. "Besides," he added with a mischievous gleam in his eye, "I have news that could more than compensate for those losses." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I've received a proposal from UC Davis," James explained. "They're interested in our regenerative agriculture model. They want to establish an exchange program, send students and researchers to learn our methods, and they're willing to fund a significant expansion of the project." "That's wonderful!" Emily exclaimed, impulsively embracing him. It's exactly what we dreamed for the educational foundation. And there's more, he continued, enjoying her enthusiasm. 2 organic supermarket chains in Chicago and Boston want exclusive contracts for our wine. They're willing to pay a considerable premium for a product that so scrupulously respects traditions and the environment. Emily's joy was palpable, radiant. In a few months, they had transformed a declining property into a model of sustainability that was beginning to receive international recognition. But beyond the commercial success, what truly moved her was seeing how their shared vision was materializing, how their values found echo in a world that so many times seemed to value only short-term profit. We should celebrate, James decided. Tonight, a special dinner, just the 2 of us. Emily nodded, feeling a tingle of anticipation. Their relationship had evolved at a deliberately slow pace, building trust on the ruins of a beginning devoid of it. The stolen kisses in the vineyard, the hands intertwined during their evening walks, the intimate conversations that extended until dawn, all formed part of a belated but deeply meaningful courtship. That night, they dined on the terrace under a star-studded sky. Emily had chosen a simple but elegant dress, amber-colored, that enhanced the golden tone of her skin and the sparkle in her eyes. James watched her enchanted, as if seeing her for the first time, marveling at how this woman who had entered his life as part of a business transaction had become the center of his universe. "Do you remember our wedding?" he suddenly asked, as he poured wine into their glasses. Emily made a face. "I'd prefer to forget it. It wasn't exactly the happiest day of my life." "Mine neither," James admitted. "I was focused on the land transfer documents. You were visibly miserable, though trying to hide it, and our families were pretending a joy that no one truly felt." "Why talk about it now?" she asked, genuinely curious. James took her hand on the table, caressing with his thumb the delicate skin of her wrist. "Because I was thinking we deserve a new beginning, a ceremony that reflects what we truly feel, not what a contract dictated." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you suggesting we renew our vows?" "I'm suggesting we marry again," he corrected. "Not for convenience or commercial strategy, but because, against all odds, I've fallen hopelessly in love with you, Emily Anderson." The formality with which he pronounced her married surname, which she rarely used, contained a sweet irony that didn't escape Emily. Her eyes filled with tears as James continued, "This time, I want to promise you love, respect, and companionship. I want to swear to you that each day I'll try to be worthy of the second chance you've given me, of the transformation you've inspired in me." Emily felt her heart might burst with happiness. The words she had so many times dreamed of hearing, that she had come to believe impossible when she accepted that marriage of convenience, now flowed from the lips of the man she had learned to love despite all her defenses. "Yes," she responded simply, her voice broken with emotion. "I want to marry you, James. Not as part of a deal, but as the culmination of a love we've built step by step, day by day, among these vines that have seen us grow together." They sealed their promise with a kiss that tasted of sweet wine and infinite possibilities, while the stars twinkled above them like silent witnesses to an everyday miracle. 2 people who had found true love in the most unlikely place, a marriage of convenience transformed by the regenerative power of mutual understanding and shared respect. The old stone chapel glowed under the May sun, its walls reflecting light with a warmth that seemed to welcome the guests arriving in small groups. Unlike the first wedding, celebrated with the cold pomp of a business agreement, this renewal of vows had the authentic intimacy of a celebration of true love. Emily waited in a small antechamber, contemplating her reflection in an antique mirror. The dress she had chosen was simple but beautiful, ivory silk with delicate embroidery of vine leaves in golden thread. Her hair, gathered with wildflowers instead of the ostentatious tiara she had worn at her first wedding, framed a face that radiated serene happiness. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly woman who had told them about the magical spring, approached with a slight limp, carrying in her wrinkled hands a small carved wooden box. "For you, child," she said with a voice cracked by age but firm in its purpose, "a gift that has waited long for a worthy owner." Emily opened the box with curiosity. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, rested an antique silver necklace with a pendant in the shape of a water drop that contained what appeared to be a tiny vine carved in green stone. "It's beautiful," she murmured, reverently touching the jewel. "But I can't accept something so valuable. It's not mine to give," the elderly woman interrupted. "It belongs to the land, to the ancestors who cared for these vineyards before you. It has passed from hand to hand for generations, waiting for someone who could restore the lost balance." With trembling but sure hands, Mrs. Wilson placed the necklace around Emily's neck. "You carry the blessing of all those who loved this land before you," she solemnly declared. "The blessing of the water that gives life and the vine that gives sustenance." Emily, moved beyond words, embraced the elderly woman with care but genuine affection. This simple gesture, this connection with the traditions and history of the place she now truly considered her home, meant more than all the luxurious gifts they had received at their first wedding. Meanwhile, in another room of the chapel, James nervously adjusted his tie in front of a similar mirror. Unlike the formal and severe suit of his first wedding, today he dressed with relaxed elegance, more in line with the man he had become. "You're unrecognizable," commented his cousin Mark, who had come from San Francisco for the occasion. "And I don't just mean the clothes." James smiled, aware of the profound transformation he had experienced. "I feel as if life truly began a year ago," he confessed. "Everything before seems like a blurred prelude, as if I were waiting for something I didn't even know I needed." "Emily," Mark nodded, pronouncing the name with respect. "I never thought I'd see the ruthless James Anderson surrender to love." "It's not surrender," James corrected with serenity. "It's evolution. Emily didn't defeat me. She showed me a better version of myself, one that was always there but that I never had the courage to recognize." A light knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Tom, the estate manager who had witnessed their entire transformation, peered in with an apologetic expression. "Mr. James, there's someone who insists on seeing you before the ceremony." Before James could respond, a figure entered the room. His father, William Anderson, whom he hadn't seen for almost a year, since he had refused to support his methods in the conflict with the tourism investors. "Father," James greeted, visibly tensing, "I didn't expect to see you here." William Anderson, a tall, thin man with a face marked by decades of ruthless negotiations, observed his son with a mixture of contradictory emotions. "I wasn't going to come," he admitted. "I considered all this renewal of vows as a sentimental weakness unworthy of an Anderson." James maintained his composure, though Mark could see how his knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists. "What made you change your mind?" The elderly man looked away, visibly uncomfortable with the vulnerability he was about to show. "I received the financial reports for the last quarter," he finally said. "The premium wine exports, the contracts with European chains, the educational project. The results are impressive." "Have you come to congratulate me on the profits?" James asked, a note of disappointment filtering into his voice. "I've come because I was wrong." The words seemed painfully torn from William's throat. "I thought you had sacrificed the family empire for a whim, for a woman who had bewitched you. But what you've built with Emily is more valuable than everything I achieved in 50 years of business." The silence that followed this confession was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. James studied his father's face, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motives, finding only the genuine repentance of a man too proud to express it openly. "Emily taught me that there are forms of success that can't be measured in accounting balances," James finally said. "That true wealth lies in balance, not in accumulation." William nodded slowly, as if assimilating a late but valuable lesson. "I would like, if you and Emily permit, to be part of what you're building," he offered, each word an exercise in humility for a man accustomed to giving orders, not asking for opportunities. "Perhaps an old dog can learn new tricks." James felt something unknotting in his chest, a tension he had carried his entire life in relation to this man, who had been simultaneously his model and his burden. "There's room for everyone at our table," he responded, extending his hand, "especially for those willing to learn and grow." When both men entered the chapel moments later, Emily, who was waiting by the altar, immediately caught the transformation in James's face. The usual tension that appeared whenever they mentioned his father had been replaced by a hopeful serenity. The ceremony was simple, but deeply moving. Instead of traditional vows, Emily and James had written their own promises, words born from shared experience, from intimate knowledge of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. "I promise you patience in difficult moments, celebration in triumphs, and absolute honesty in every step of the way." James declared, his voice firm but charged with emotion. "I promise to always remember that the most valuable thing I possess is not lands or businesses, but your trust and your love. I promise to be your companion in every adventure, your refuge in every storm, and your equal in every decision," Emily responded, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes. "I promise to remind you, when the world tries to convince you otherwise, that true success is measured in moments of connection, not in figures on a page." When the minister declared them husband and wife again, the kiss they shared was full of fulfilled promises and dreams yet to be realized. The applause of those present, vineyard workers, townspeople, true friends instead of business associates, resonated in the ancient stones of the chapel like a collective blessing. The subsequent celebration took place among the century-old vines, long tables arranged between the silver vines, decorated with wildflowers and aromatic herbs from Emily's garden. The aroma of rosemary and thyme mingled with that of traditional dishes prepared with products from the land they had helped to heal. At sunset, when the golden light bathed the vineyards, transforming them into an undulating sea of gold and silver, Emily and James moved away for a moment from the celebration, walking hand in hand to the spring that had changed the course of their lives. "Are you happy?" James asked, observing how the last light of day played on his wife's face, illuminating the droplet-shaped pendant that rested on her chest. Emily contemplated the crystalline water emerging from the earth, symbol of all they had discovered together: hidden resources, unexplored possibilities, a capacity for love that neither had believed possible at the beginning. "More than happy," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm at peace. I've found my purpose and my home, all in the place I least expected." James kissed her forehead with reverence, aware of the everyday miracle they had built together, a marriage that had begun as a cold and calculated business agreement, transformed by daily work, courageous honesty, and the shared will to see beyond appearances. The sun finally set behind the Mayacamas mountains, but they remained beside the spring a moment longer, silent witnesses to the constant flow of water that, like their love, had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge and transform everything in its path. A year after the renewal of vows, Anderson Estate bustled with unusual activity. Agronomy students from universities across America mingled with local farmers, environmental researchers, and specialized journalists, all gathered for the official inauguration of the Center for Traditional and Sustainable Agriculture Studies. Emily, notebook in hand, supervised the final details while guiding a group of visitors through the facilities. The old barn had been transformed into a modern educational space that respected traditional architecture, with classrooms, laboratories, and a specialized library that already housed an impressive collection of ancient treatises and contemporary publications. "The center operates according to 3 fundamental principles," she explained, with the passion and clarity that had made her a reference in the sector. "Respect for ancestral knowledge, responsible innovation, and generational transmission. We firmly believe that the future of sustainable agriculture lies in the selective recovery of traditional techniques combined with appropriate technologies." The visitors nodded, impressed both by the facilities and by the coherent philosophy that permeated every aspect of the project. From the solar panels that provided clean energy to the rainwater collection and purification system, everything had been designed to function in harmony with the natural environment. In another sector of the property, James led a group of potential investors through the recovered vineyards, where the harvest promised to be exceptional in both quantity and quality. "What you see here is the result of a radically different approach," he explained, stopping beside a particularly ancient vine. "We don't treat the land as a resource to exploit until exhaustion, but as a partner with whom to collaborate. Every decision we make considers the long-term impact, not just the immediate benefit." Among the investors was Richard Thompson, representative of a Michigan fund specializing in sustainable projects, who observed everything with a critical but interested eye. "Your results are impressive, Mr. Anderson," he commented, examining the production and efficiency data James had provided him. "But what truly intrigues me is how you've managed to achieve this balance between profitability and responsibility. Most projects sacrifice one in favor of the other." James smiled, remembering how he himself would have shared that skepticism not long ago. "The secret lies in changing the temporal perspective," he replied. When you measure success in decades, not in quarters, the decisions that favor the health of the ecosystem also become the most profitable in the long term. The conversation continued as they returned to the central area, where the inaugural ceremony would take place. James sought Emily with his gaze, finally locating her near the expanded greenhouse, where now not only medicinal herbs were cultivated, but also endangered native varieties as part of a conservation program. He observed her for a moment, marveling once more at the transformation this woman had catalyzed, not just in the vineyards or in the family business, but in his very soul. Where before he saw only resources to exploit and balances to maximize, now he perceived connections, cycles, possibilities of collaboration with nature instead of domination. Emily felt his gaze and raised her eyes, giving him a smile that still made his heart leap in his chest. With a discreet gesture, she indicated he should approach. "I want to introduce you to someone special," she said when James reached her side. "Professor Johnson from UC Davis. He's developing a scholarship program for young people from rural communities who want to train in sustainable agriculture without abandoning their roots." The afternoon advanced toward the culminating moment, the inauguration ceremony, where Emily and James would officially share their vision with the world. They had chosen to hold the event in the central courtyard of the estate, decorated for the occasion with elements that reflected the essence of the project: garlands of aromatic herbs, baskets of freshly harvested grapes, vases with wildflowers that grew among the vines. While the guests took their seats, Emily and James momentarily retired to the library, their shared refuge, for an instant of calm before the event. "Nervous?" he asked, observing how Emily unnecessarily adjusted the papers of her speech. "A little," she admitted with a smile. "It's strange to think that what began as a survival strategy has transformed into a model that others want to follow." James took her hands in his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "It's not strange at all," he replied. "Truth has its own strength, and what we've built here is authentic, born from real convictions and honest work." Emily nodded, appreciating as always the clarity with which James now saw the world, so different from the calculating vision that had dominated his previous life. "Do you know what I was thinking this morning?" she said as they headed toward the courtyard where they were awaited. "That our story is like that of these vines. We began in difficult circumstances, faced storms that threatened to destroy us, but found ways to grow together, to intertwine our roots until making us stronger. And now we spread seeds," James completed, indicating the students and farmers who were animatedly conversing, exchanging knowledge and experiences. "Ideas that will travel far, that will germinate in lands we will never know." The ceremony was simple, but deeply significant. Emily spoke about the importance of preserving traditional knowledge, of reconnecting new generations with the wisdom of the land. James shared how a regenerative approach could revitalize not only exhausted soils, but entire communities that depended on agriculture. Together they revealed future plans, a microcredit program for small farmers who wanted to transition to sustainable methods, a research laboratory in collaboration with American universities, a network for exchanging native seeds to preserve local biodiversity. When they concluded their presentation, the applause resonated among the century-old walls of the estate. But for Emily and James, the true applause was the whisper of the wind among the recovered vines, the constant murmur of the spring that continued to flow crystalline, the laughter of the village children who now regularly came to learn about plants in workshops specially designed for them. That evening, when all the guests had departed and the estate returned to its usual tranquility, Emily and James walked together under the silvery light of the full moon, following a familiar path among the vines that had been silent witnesses to their transformation. "There's something I haven't told you," Emily commented as they stopped beside the oldest vine on the property, a millennial plant that had survived entire civilizations. "I've been waiting for the right moment." James looked at her with curiosity, noting a special gleam in her eyes, a mixture of nervousness and contained joy. "What is it?" Emily took his hand and gently placed it on her belly, still flat, but which would soon begin to reveal the miracle it harbored. "Life always finds new paths," she murmured. "Like water that emerges where no one expects it, like vines that regerminate after the severest pruning." James understood immediately, his eyes opening in amazement and then filling with tears of happiness. Without words, he drew Emily to him, embracing her with infinite tenderness, aware of the fragile and powerful treasure they now shared. They remained thus, united under the stars that had witnessed the eternal cycle of seasons, fall and rebirth, the constant transformation that is the only true permanence. Their story, which had begun as a cold agreement between strangers, now blossomed in a new life, living proof that authentic love can arise in the most unlikely terrain when cultivated with patience, honesty, and mutual respect. "Do you know what name I'd like if it's a girl?" Emily whispered. "Elizabeth. Like your grandmother, who transformed her cage into a refuge of knowledge and beauty. I'd like our daughter to bear the name of a woman who knew how to create light in darkness." James nodded, moved by the connection Emily established with his lineage, by the way she honored even the painful parts of his family history by transforming them into inspiration. "And if it's a boy," he responded, "we could call him Robert, like your father. To remember that errors and difficulties are also part of the path that brought us here." They kissed under the millennial vine, sealing this new chapter of their shared story. The gentle wind moved the silver leaves, creating a murmur that sounded almost like a blessing, like the ancient voice of the earth approving this union that had begun in cold calculation but had blossomed into the most authentic love. In that perfect moment, as the moon bathed the vineyards in its silvery light and the future unfolded before them full of promises, Emily and James understood the deepest truth they had discovered in their journey, that the capacity for transformation, for reinvention, for finding beauty and purpose even in the most difficult beginnings, is the most precious gift we can offer each other. And so under the starry sky of Napa Valley, among vines that had seen entire civilizations pass, they sealed their commitment not only to each other, but to the land they had learned to love and protect, to the community they had helped revitalize, and to the future that already grew like a silent but unbreakable promise in Emily's womb.